Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for leaving your children at home. That's a joke. I'm Sue Goodwin, and I'm co-editor of a book that just came out last week on contemporary motherhoods in Australia. It's called The Good Mother, which for some reason my children find hilarious and totally inappropriate. I'd like to introduce Manne, our speaker today. Anne is an Australian journalist and a social philosopher. She, of anyone, has put the worth of children centre stage in Australian debate. Yes, children are worth it, and actually worth a lot more than they're currently getting. Anne's new book, Scenes from a Country Childhood, has recently been released. Now, Manne takes children seriously. She's put back on the agenda this kind of radical idea that how we treat children matters. As a result, her work taps into those anxieties that keep us all awake at night, but are very tricky to grapple with in the broad light of day. The insufficiency of many of our options for early childcare, the difficulties we face reconciling work and family, the ticking and the sometimes exploding bomb of fertility decisions, and the impact of new forms of capitalism on the way that we bring up our children. In her 2005 book, Motherhood, How Should We Care for Our Children?, she draws on a huge range of resources in order to show a way out of the current quagmire of work-family life. In it, she has the courage to try and persuade us that we should treat the precious love for children with care. In her 2008 quarterly essay, Love and Money, the Family and the Free Market, Anne looks at the challenge of balancing love and economics and the value our society places on both. Somewhat controversially, Manne argues that neoliberal economics are creating a new work-centred good mother. In this sense, Anne is putting forward some fairly risky ideas, so I would suggest that Manne indeed is a woman with dangerous ideas. I introduce Anne.
Thank you, Sue. I have to tell you that my daughters thought this topic was absolutely hilarious, and they wanted the right of reply next year. Are parents worth it? So I hope you all come along and hear their version of events. In an ad for men's skincare, TV star Patrick Dempsey is one of life's winners. He represents the free market society's ideal type. He exudes sex, power and wealth. I hope some of you have seen it. Even his stubble looks expensive. In the closing frames of the ad, he ever so briefly caresses a baby and gazes into the camera. Because you are worth it. That phrase, reeking of narcissism, self-obsession and entitlement, is an emblem of our age. Now there's another ad, which is a kind of postscript, in the because you are worth it genre. It's a magazine ad for a Porsche. It has the tagline, Porsche's new baby, an excellent reason to delay yours. So, are children worth it? Those two messages, are children worth it and because you're worth it, I suggest, are very closely linked. Now, as Sue has said, I'm not going to be exploring purely the negative side of parenting, although I do know it well. As a mother and a citizen, I've been arguing for parental leave policies since the mid-90s, when it was regarded as scandalous. or improving childcare at a level that we presently do not have on offer. And I've been consistently trying to insert the child's point of view into our cultural conversation about work and family. So what interests me is what kind of society is now asking, are children worth it? In a recent article in the New York Times, Jennifer Senior, it was called All Joy and No Fun, Why Parents Hate Parenting. It was about how parents love their kids but hated their lives. Life shrinks to the size of a teacup, wailed one. Everything turns to shit, said another. Not so much bundles of joy, but pint-sized life wreckers. A mother was getting together a volume on children, and writers, mothers with children and writers who didn't have children. And she found herself looking longingly at the contributions of childless women who had the time to travel, to write and work uninterruptedly, and even to finish dinner. Jennifer Senior herself arrives home in an idyllic scene with a toddler rushing towards her, open arms, only to be pelted when she gets in the door with wooden blocks. But she bases her article on something more solid than this. One Texan study, and many others like it, show that mothers often record in diaries that moment to moment they don't actually find child rearing as enjoyable as some other activities, even in one study, and housework. And then I looked at all the mummy blogs and the parenting websites and articles in the press. And there was such an outpouring of negativity that Mia Friedman, who writes on these matters and has a blog, felt that it might have all gone too far. She said, "We're frightening the horses," speaking of childless people still making their decisions. "We're scaring the bejesus out of people who don't yet have them but thought they might like them one day." So she turned her blog over to parents to say what they loved about parenting. But in another sign of the times, she was worried about doing so because in speaking positively about being a parent, she might offend those who didn't have children or those who were seriously pissed with the whole idea of having children. And sure enough, they were offended, almost as offended as those who jumped furiously on Newsreader a little time earlier, Jacinta Tynan, who had said that she not only enjoyed mothering, but, get this, found it easy peasy. The fury was unstoppable. And then another way, are children worth it, is being answered, is all the anxious assessments of how much they cost us. August bodies of researchers tell us that across a child's lifespan, these are quite gloomy assessments, they cost us more than $500,000. In the election campaign, you would have all heard working families appealed to again and again. In the Herald Sun, there was an assessment of what working families were getting from one party and what working families were getting from another. And it reminded me of the tabloids' hard-nosed assessments of the show bags. You know, you get at the Royal Easter show, this bag has 5 more Smarties and a plastic keyring and a violet crumble and a Freddo frog in the other. They were partly far too similar. They were also utterly trivial, because any larger vision of the kind of society we might want to be building for parents and children was conspicuously absent. If we're to have working families, we will surely have childcare. But here again, we've got this question, are children worth it? Recently, the ALP wanted to improve the quality of childcare. A famous child psychologist has visited Australia, and he said, looking at the ratio permitted of caregivers to babies, 5 babies to 1 caregiver that are permitted in childcare centres, he called it a licence for neglect. So surely that's reason for action. And indeed, a recent survey by a national childcare watchdog found 1 in 8 had a reasonable ability to treat all children in their care fairly and equally. 1 in 5 centres had an unsatisfactory rating that the centre ensure buildings and equipment is safe. More than a quarter of centres had an unsatisfactory rating over staff ensuring that toileting and nappy changing procedures were positive experiences. But the Australian Labor Party's efforts were greeted by a chorus of whinge. The coalition opposed it. Too expensive. Many childcare proprietors opposed it and threatened an exodus of children in their care. The tabloids were in uproar over this imminent disaster of parents walking their children out of childcare and therefore out of the workforce. What next, whined one blogger? In-ground swimming pools for every child? And this is always a favourite response. Why do all taxpayers have to pay if parents choose to have children? And of course, I hope those people who are objecting to the improvements of care are going to be consistent when it comes to going into nursing homes. Are children worth it? A grim answer to that question is also seen in the way we characterise those who look after children. Linda Hirschman, a lawyer and prominent feminist in the US, caused a huge furore a couple of years ago when she said out loud what a lot of people have been thinking. She described a life centred on children rather than on-market work, on paid work, as a lesser life. She exhorted women to pursue self-interest at every point. And I quote, "The best way to treat work seriously is find the money. Money is the marker of success in a market economy. It usually accompanies power and it enables the bearer to wield power, including in the family." And just in case people weren't quite sure of the message, she wrote a book called Get to Work. For Hirschman, the only life worth living was in the paid workforce. Anyone centering, she was also attacking not just stay-at-home mothers, but mothers who were working part-time, anyone who wasn't full-on as a stellar full-time career person. She said of those living these lesser lives, and I quote again, "They were bearing most of the burden of work, always associated with the lowest caste, sweeping and cleaning bodily waste. They have voluntarily become untouchables." "Get mums working," screamed another headline, this time in Australia. This was about Peter Costello and efforts on welfare to work measures. Then we had another headline, "Treasury gets tough on bludging soccer mums." This was a headline last year in the Daily Telegraph. And this time it was mothers of school-aged children who weren't going back to work early enough. And it was the Treasury Secretary, one of the highest officials in the land, who was saying that family tax benefits should be cut to at-home mothers of school-aged children to get them back to work. But most interestingly, he said, and I quote, "Treasury," he opined piously, "has as its goal supporting a society that allows individuals to lead lives of value." Lives of value. So in a way, the Madonna has become a deadbeat mum. And that kind of aggression and derision towards caregivers of children also, of course, passes on children themselves. Whether adults need child-free places for holidays or for us to eat out without being interrupted. While it is sexist and misogynist to call women names or racist to use nasty epithets signalling their inferiority, it is acceptable for children to be called sprogs or fartlings, just to take a few examples, while parents are increasingly called breeders. So maybe we need a name for this anti-child sentiment. And there's no word in the English language, interestingly. It's nothing like misandry or misogyny or racism. We no longer have segregation, but we do have holiday places boasting of being child-free, as well as those, perhaps, leisure echelon places that invite dogs, cats, and children. So what is all this about? Why all the angst and ambivalence? What sort of a society is asking these questions? Well, this is particularly pertinent because the New York Times article I first referred to found that when American parents' enjoyment of their task was compared to Danish parents, the Danish parents were a lot happier. Becoming a parent did add to life satisfaction rather than detract. And that might tell you about a society which has free healthcare, education, and I should speak of the whole of Scandinavia, which has much better policies of longer parental leave and spends much more on childcare than the nation, the US, where these very disaffected studies were taking place, where it took 11 years of political struggle to get a mere 3 months of unpaid leave around the birth of a child or for some other major family event. And the same thing happened when researchers looked at Ohio mothers in the US, who were a lot less happy than French mothers, who also spend a lot more and have longer periods around childbirth, early childhood, but also have, in both cases of Scandinavia and France, very high rates of women working. In the French case, it's interesting because although they have a marginally lower standard of living than the US, they have far more weeks of holidays per year, a 35-hour week, and many more supports for parents. So it's perhaps unsurprising that conditions of parenthood are more enjoyable. All this is telling us that the social and cultural context of parenting is crucial. Our society, in contrast, has been increasingly based on a radical individualism. Those values of the marketplace are penetrating even intimate life. The commercialisation of intimate life, one critic calls it. It's a society that rewards achievement, but also penalises care. In fact, if you did a map of inequality, then you would find those who give care at the bottom. In all such societies, caregivers and mothers, and parents in particular, are going to find it difficult. And they will find themselves confronting often insoluble dilemmas over work and care. Recall for a moment Linda Hirschman's title of that book I told you about, Get to Work. One way of seeing it is just the constant ongoing mother wars, conflicts between different groups of women who think the way they should base their life is right, and the arguments which then follow. But I don't think that's very illuminating. What's much more illuminating is to look at most Western governments, the OECD, the European Union, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And the title of one OECD report captures the mood: putting more women to work. Note, putting. All see economic advantages to increasing women's workforce participation. All advocate what they call post-maternalist policies. And that involves reducing funds or cutting funds towards the older models of the family and placing it towards childcare. The message, get to work, is a core element of a shift affecting all Western societies. One scholar calls it the farewell to maternalism, where countries move from a maternalist model where mothers were expected to stay home full-time, as in the 1950s, 60s, and where people were actually paid to stay home in the case of a sole parent or a widow. That is, care was attributed a value. But before you assume that this model of employment for all, as it is now called, is going to be a feminist utopia, I'd point out that those same policy documents make it clear that women are expected to enter the labour force, but also go on providing and organising household care. And that, to me, sounds a little more like the road to exhaustion than emancipation. So that last aspect gives us a way of judging the new paradigm. It's more about economic issues than women's liberation. One of the key issues is falling fertility, and as fewer children are born, the working age population gets less, and it becomes more difficult to support the sick, both children and particularly ageing baby boomers. It is much more difficult to support all of those people with diminishing taxes from a smaller population of those of working age. So it's in that context we should now understand Tony Abbott's swing from being opposed to things like parental leave to supporting it. In a way, they too are, even as they support a narrow period of time around mothers, around childbirth, are moving to the farewell to maternalism, even a conservative social Catholic like Tony Abbott. So the new model is that women undertake paid work as well as care, and they will be granted, as men might be granted, insofar as we make it gender neutral, brief leaves of absence. And so despite our rhetoric about choice, it's more like Henry Ford's quip about the early Fords coming off the production line. You can have any colour you want so long as it's black. You can have any choice you want so long as it's work. And although rarely made explicit, this new capitalism is contingent on a trade-off. Higher productivity translated into not more time with family, but more hours worked per family to service a consumption habit. Ever fewer people live in ever larger houses. Australians now live in the largest houses in the world. We have a housing crisis in terms of affordability and a work spend cycle that leaves many families exhausted and spent, trapped by high levels of indebtedness. And we have the dubious distinction of having amongst the highest the longest working hours in OECD nations. So this get-to-work message is a society at the same time with a very parsimonious attitude to state spending and debt. There's a huge competition between the parties over who will have the least contribution to the deficit during the election. And of course that affects the spending on crucial things like childcare and parental leave and support for parents. And we have the desire to deregulate the labour market at a time when a new group of workers have care responsibilities. But most importantly of all, I think it's a society which has given work, for all its very real benefits and its very real rewards, a kind of enchanted value. Better than sex, runs one book. Better than sex, how a whole generation got hooked on work. Actually, I wondered whether they'd had sex recently when I read that title. Or perhaps at all. Then we have Ross Gittins, the economics commentator. And he noticed of one of the budgets, he said, work, less an ethic, more an order. Work, work, more work. The budget was obsessed by work. Those who aren't working should be. Those who are working aren't working enough. And those considering retirement should resist the temptation. Now, when we sanctify paid work, because women for so long have been held away from the pleasures and rewards of work, because once upon a time, not so long ago, they had to resign from the public service, for example, as soon as they got married. So deeply was it assumed that they would centre their lives on care and family and not on work. But because of that past, it can mean that we're rather slow to realise that all this sanctification of work does not necessarily make it easy for mothers or fathers who want to take seriously care responsibilities to combine those responsibilities and work. It means that the model for the ideal worker, based on success of the old male life pattern, training early, getting established in the professions, working long hours, taking no time out, competing against other professionals, and with having few family responsibilities to ever distract them from that task. That was the ideal worker. And we really haven't altered that. And in fact, I think the best way of looking at many of the top jobs in a society is to say that these are really two-person careers. That is, each job assumes a person off-field who is carrying out all the care activities, like the executive wife, if you like. Perhaps Julia Gillard's partner now. But nonetheless, there's someone else who has to take care of the everything else. And it's those values surrounding the proper worker which act as a subtle but pervasive form of covert discrimination against parents. At one academic conference, I noticed an older academic advising young women to write several extra articles before they gave birth, and then at regular intervals they could send them off for publication. So then you could conceal any gap in your curriculum vitae. And that's the long hours work culture of professional jobs, which often sees highly trained parents who want to be also committed parents. Many women I know who might think of a medical specialty, nonetheless end up working as GPs. because very little of those kinds of professions have been thought through. And then, of course, in the long hours professionals, we have the bravado, our role model, 24/7 Kevin. And short of a night nanny, a day nanny, and a kind of army of servants, you're not going to be a reasonable father, let alone a reasonable primary caregiver, working those kinds of hours. Here's another problem. Many have asked the question as to how we try and equal up the contribution that mothers make and fathers make to children's lives. And yet again, the Get to Work Society entrenches actually those old traditional ideas. Hence, one night I was at dinner looking at a young couple, talking to them and about their hopes about how they would live after the baby was born. And I was listening to the mother and I was listening to the father, but I was also listening to the father boast that he worked already a 16-hour day. And the kind of pride with which he said that made me think there were likely to be difficulties after the child was born. And indeed there were. There was non-stop conflict because that was so hard to negotiate when he had so much pride in that. But then when you think about that, here's another example, this time from an older man who said he's now looking after his elderly mother and he's out of the workforce. And he says, if a man is caring for others, calling, shopping, visiting, it shows the world he has failed as a man. Failed as a man. So men are still so much judged according to their position in the labour market. And at the upper echelons of careers, I think one of the American commentators, Ali Hochschild, is right when she says that the emotional magnets of work and family are kind of in the process of swapping places. There you'll find walking resumes. And the problem with that is time with the child is always a loss to the resume. And a loss to the resume is a gain for the child, but the tremendous tension between it. And neither culture really is softening either the demands that are expected to be met on behalf of children, nor those of the ideal worker. Economy, of course, is about far more than the figures. And I think the kind of culture we carry with it, the sort of maternal culture we're carrying with it at the moment, is a very fragmented one. So we will have, let's say, programs like Desperate Housewives on TV. Anyone here know the character of Brie? Kind of neurotic, housewife of old. And it is certainly true that some people will live according to those old ideals. But at the same time, we are seeing very much transformed ideals of what the good mother is. Tremendous angst at the moment in Australia, but particularly in the US, is over an alleged new social evil called helicopter parenting. I look at the parenting blogs and they're incredibly worried about this question. Child psychologists are busily writing about it, adolescent psychologists. When you actually look at the time spent with children, though, it reveals something interesting. First of all, working parents, both fathers have increased their time with children, but also mothers in particular, have not in any way reduced hour for hour the time that they're spending at work, the time that they're spending with children. So they're putting in an incredible effort. They might be cutting on leisure and sleep, but they're not actually reducing nearly as much as you would expect given the amount of time they're putting in at work, the time that they're spending with children. And one survey of it showed that it averaged out about one-on-one interactive time of these alleged helicopter parents at 12.9 hours a week. Actually, I love that bogus accuracy, don't you? 0.9, not 0.8, but 0.9. But it's an average. Reading a story, teaching a child, one-on-one activities. So including weekends, that's less than 2 hours a day, which doesn't strike me as a particularly obtrusive helicopter. Of course, involved with other activities with children when they're not, just centring on the child. But nonetheless, it sounded like actually a family life which might be stressed and stretched, but rising to meet the new challenges and not actually selling children short. But it may be one of the reasons, because women are keeping up so much time with children, and there is so little softening of the overall regime in which they are actually doing more work, that we are seeing that sense of pleasurelessness that Jennifer Senior was talking about, that on top of their job, they go home to the second shift. And something else is true too. In this hyper-competitive society, we've seen a kind of defensive narcissism, I'll call it. If you've seen, there was an explosion at the time we took the great leap forward into the free market society with game shows. We're kind of playing with this whole idea, Survivor, and there's all these assault courses and people were flinging themselves over them. Shows like Dog Eat Dog and The Weakest Link, they were all multiplying. In a way, we were playing with the kind of new ethos in the workplace, I think. And also people began driving big sort of tanks. They're like armoured vehicles, they're enormous, with names like Wrangler and Trooper and Defender. Crossfire, sounds like you're in, Baghdad, but you're just on a suburban street. And it would be naive to think that parenting is not affected by that. So rather than seeing parents being sort of intrusive and in some way to be criticised for the kind of efforts they're making on behalf of children, I think it's hardly surprising that some of those values from the workplace, where the productivity, there was so much emphasis on improving productivity, in working harder and smarter and delivering more, that is starting to seep through into the culture of parenting. Even the idea of quality time itself is a bit like trying to get more out of one calibrated quality hour than actually spending a bit of unstructured time. And so much time is built now around, on top of already demanding working lives, structured time, and all of that time is usually ferrying children to one or other improving activity, so that no moment is left uncultivated, no fallow time, no free. It's like they're kind of paddocks, that never get left in fallow. We're overcropping children, I may say. Quality time spent with children, though, was not really what children wanted. When someone went and wrote a book after asking children what they longed for more than anything else was unhurried time, time hanging out, time watching TV, time just being with parents but not actually part of this whole kind of treadmill. But you'll notice, I hope, that my tone's not particularly condemnatory of the helicopter parent, the over-involved parent, the intensive mother discourse. There's all sorts of ways sociologists have of making it sound very nasty indeed. And I think it's a lot more benign than that.